For most fans of the franchise, Marvel's Phase 4 was an undeniable step back, both in terms of stakes, but also in terms of quality.
Boner.
The threads of the franchise spread in too many directions for the audience to keep up with, as series after series hit Disney+, feeding into what has always been the worst part of Marvel Comics culture, that fans have to do homework in order to understand the entirety of the larger narrative. Sure, some of the Disney Plus series were great, but a few were below the standards that audiences had come to expect, and faith that all narrative threads would eventually lead to a meaningful conclusion has been eroded significantly. This is obviously a huge difference from when the MCU began, with Phase 1 of the universe largely being held up by a handful of characters. While many critics will point to the difficulties of keeping such a large and varied universe of characters interesting to the largest movie-going audience ever, I think Marvel has had a more significant problem on their hands for the past 2 years, one that Ryan Coogler and the latest Black Panther film go out of their way to correct. Before we jump into it, I have to say something. Comics are inherently political, particularly Marvel comics. Whether or not you agree with those political ideologies is up to you, but the source material of the characters on the screen in these films were written by ethnic, religious, and racial minorities about the socio-political realities of being a part of those groups. X-Men is about the civil rights movement. Spider-Man is about the realities of poverty. Iron Man battles alcoholism. Wasp is a domestic abuse survivor. Deadpool is canonically bisexual. Doctor Strange and Daredevil deal with disability, so on and so forth. It is natural then that Marvel's on-screen presence would reflect these socio-political ideologies, and this is clear from the very first film that was a part of the MCU.
1.
Iron Man opens with a war prophet's here being exposed to the reality of the violence and horror he traffics. The film then goes on to make a clear statement about the dangers of allowing the weapons industry to be dominated by those who seek profits instead of justice. Jeff Bridges' Obadiah Stane is transparently consumed by a need to amass power and capital, regardless of what it takes. His need for power is what ultimately leads him to use Stark Industries scientists to create the Ironmonger, a suit that dwarfs Iron Man's in both size and capability. Tony Stark is only able to defeat Obadiah Stane by exploiting his hunger for power, as he knows that he would have cut corners by avoiding the necessary testing to fully develop the weapon. This has been a common refrain in the MCU for some time now. Villains too hungry for control have their powers used against them, not because they are weak, but because they are blinded by their own pride. Superhero comics have always been envisioned as morality tales, and this legacy has continued in large part well into the 21st century. With Phase 4, however, the refrain of using the arch-villain's own powers against them shifted into something that fails to follow the internal logic of the nearly 15-year-old cinematic franchise.
Erasing blood clot.
Oh, and Bruce swooping down from literal outer space to save the day in my story?
Captain America Civil War, which starts the third phase of the MCU, is a movie about political differences. When two parties come to a meaningful disagreement that cannot be resolved through merely talking it out, they turn to a continuation of politics by other means: war. While some lines of communication remain open from either side, and there are further attempts to convince the leaders of each faction to see a different perspective, violence becomes inevitable. Iron Man and Captain America cannot see eye to eye, and there is no immediate resolution to the conflict, as it leaves both sides with life-altering consequences at the end of the film. In Phase 4, however, violence is rarely the answer to dealing with immovable villains, misguided insurgents, or the puppet masters who pull their strings. Violence is the answer to the foot soldier, to the henchman, to those that support the injustice our heroes fight. But to deal with the main antagonist in more than a few of these stories, heroes use their words. Now, this may sound like a good thing, that heroes don't need to resort to violence to serve justice, but I would argue that it isn't. Firstly, because our protagonists are still harming the nameless and faceless masses that are either paid as security or are ideologically motivated to risk life and limb. What's more concerning, however, is the concept that a world that has seen so much pain, misery, and catastrophe just hasn't made their argument powerful enough or hasn't spoken to the right people, as though those who commit heinous acts just needed someone to tell them that they were a bully, and then the curse would be lifted. Imagine telling the survivors of Ultron's attacks that the carnage could have been prevented if someone just had a talk with the villainous AI. The most stunning example of this trend is in the conclusion of The Falcon and Winter Soldier, where Sam Wilson calmly walks up to the people who set the events in motion that threaten the well-being of people across the globe and speaks truth to power, seemingly resolving the issue that caused the flag smashers to crop up in the first place. We are left with no guarantees that those responsible will change or be punished, instead left to believe that one impassioned speech changed everything. This is not to say that Marvel's heroes should attempt to decapitate anyone who espouses a different viewpoint than them, but it makes little sense in the context of this world that a Scarlet Witch who was destroying the lives of billions of people just needed a 5-minute therapy session to figure out what she was doing wrong. At a certain point, it becomes insulting to the audience's intelligence. Spoilers ahead for Black Panther Wakanda Forever. This is where Black Panther 2 takes a step forward and handles the conflict better than most of the films that preceded it. The film begins with a scene that explains the loss of Chadwick Boseman's T'Challa. In this scene, we meet a Shuri who is racked by guilt, grief, and anger. She is a fallible leader who literally pushes help away and ultimately waits too long to act. This trend continues through her arc, as she is placed in more situations where she is asked to lead and responds by pushing those who are equipped to help her away. Like when she attempts to convince Ironheart to accompany her back to Wakanda, or when she tries to lose the police without Okoye's help. The film's other focus, Namor, or Namor, is similarly a flawed leader. Like Shuri, Namor is a leader whose outlook on the world is shaped by the trauma of losing family members to violence. His personality and leadership style is largely defined by his interactions with an imperialist power that pushed his ancestors off of their land and met his people with violence when they returned peacefully. His sole interest is in keeping his people almost entirely cut off from the world. He is willing to go to war with another powerful nation to ensure that his people remain in the shadows. Black Panther 2 makes it clear in the first act that both Wakanda and Talokan are isolationist nations. The key difference between them being that Wakanda is aware of the larger world and participates, albeit sparingly, with the other nations of the world. Even though both societies see those outside their borders through a militarized, nationalist lens, it is the Wakandans who are willing to adapt to their circumstances, and that's likely a credit to their succession of rulers, and T'Challa in particular, that the country is open to changing when faced with adversity. Talokan, on the other hand, has had the same ruler for centuries, and because of that, refuses to adapt even slightly. Critically, Shuri ascends into the role of Black Panther and is able to defeat Namor and his army, not because she remains inflexible, but because she, as well as her military, adopt new strategies, accept help, and work with what they are given. Wakanda Forever is a political movie, not because of the cast, but because of the subject matter. It is a story about how leaders who cannot change and are led by pride rather than the interest of their people are always close to violence. Though the pacing was strange and some of the moments of grief rang a bit hollow to me, I loved Wakanda Forever, if for no other reason than that the characters felt like real people grappling with their traumas in a way that very few MCU characters have recently. Did you like Wakanda Forever? Did Shuri's arc feel believable to you? Let me know in the comments down below. Throw a spear at that like and subscribe button for more of my content. It truly helps.